My name is Maggie Palmer. I'm from Lewisham SWP. I'm a Unite rep in the NHS. This meeting is Turkey, Authoritarian, Conservatism, and we're going to have the speaker speaking for 35 minutes, and then there'll be questions and contributions. Just before I introduce our speaker, we've got a couple of books here. There's the New Cultural Climate in Turkey, Living in a Shop Window, and then we've got a collection of writings and papers in Turkey Reframed, and they're both from Bookmarks, or you can buy these afterwards. So our speaker tonight is Margulies, and he's part of our organisation in Turkey. Thank you.
I have two apologies to make. One is for anyone who'd much rather be in front of the television preparing to watch the cup final. But it's not my fault, I don't do the timing. The other is, it's always difficult to do talks like this because I know there are people in the room who know as much about Turkey as I do, so they will probably find the talk a bit tedious. And there's people in the room who don't know anything about Turkey who probably find some of the talk difficult to follow. So it's always very difficult to pitch it at the right level when you do a mixed meeting like this. But I'll do my best. There are, I think, two keyholes through which you can look to see what's going on in Turkey and what has gone on in Turkey for quite a long time. One of the keyholes is the Kurdish problem, which most people know about. The other keyhole, which fewer people know about, even in Turkey, is the Sunni Muslim majority in the country. But before I can tell you why I think those are the two key issues about Turkish history, I need to tell you a little bit about history. Because I was in Holland last month, and I was at a meeting which had nothing to do with politics, it had to do with poetry. And during the meeting I said I'm a socialist and I'm an atheist. And afterwards a woman came up to me and said, "Can you be a socialist in Turkey? And can you be an atheist in Turkey?" I fully understand why she asks that question, because in the West, the general sort of uninformed, middle-of-the-road opinion is that Turkey is this horrific prison house where no one can do anything, nothing happens except for oppression, torture, etc. Now, first of all, if anyone here thinks that, you should put that aside and forget all about it, because it isn't true and it hasn't been true for quite a long time. There's a very lively, very dynamic struggle in Turkey. At the moment, not in the sense of industrial struggle, but all sorts of other, more directly political struggles. It's not a prison cell in Turkey. Nevertheless, the reason people have this kind of view of it, which isn't far wrong, but quite wrong, the reason people have this view is that Turkish history, until quite recently, was the history of a state which was founded in 1923 in such a way as to exclude most of the population of the country. In the following sense, it was set up in 1923 as a Turkish Muslim Sunni nation state. The Muslim and the Sunni bit was never stressed by the founding cadres of the Kemalist state, but it was a Turkish nation state, and unspoken though it was, also a Sunni Muslim Turkish state. This was a problem both for the state and for the people of the country, because most of the people in the country were neither Turkish nor Muslim, or Muslim but not Sunni Muslim. Obviously, there was something like 20% of the population who were Kurdish. So I assume I don't need to say very much about who the Kurds are. But in a couple of sentences, Kurds are the fourth largest ethnic group in the Middle East, after Arabs, Persians and Turks, and they're the only one who don't have their own state. They have a separate language, which is different from all the others. It's an Indo-European language, a separate history, a well-defined geographical area where they live, which covers the southeastern corner of Turkey and the corners of Syria, Iraq and Iran, which merge with that southeastern corner of Turkey. So about 20% of the population of the modern Turkish state are Kurdish, so they're not Turkish. Then something like 20%, and there is overlap because some of the Kurds are not Sunni Muslims, about 20% of the population are Alevi Muslims. The Alevi are sort of like the Shiites in Iran in terms of religion. Not quite the same, and there's even a debate amongst some Alevi themselves whether Aleviism is part of Islam or not, but generally it is considered to be. So there's 20% who are Turkish and Muslim, but not Sunni Muslims. There were smaller minorities who were neither Turkish, nor Sunni, nor Muslim at all, namely Jews, Armenians, Greeks, and quite a large number of other minorities, ethnic and or religious, in smaller numbers than Greeks, Armenians, and Jews. Now, in their case, of course, you know, they're completely excluded from the model of the modern Turkish citizen which the founders of the state had in their minds. What I've said so far, in Turkey, anyone except for a Turkish racist would know and completely agree with. But in addition to all of this, the founders of the modern Turkish state also weren't very happy with the Turkish Muslim Sunni part of the population, which basically means everyone else except for the minority, other than the minorities I've just gone through. Because the founders of the modern Turkish state had a model of a modern civilized citizen, which basically meant someone who looked, dressed and behaved like a Western European. For the founders of the state, being modern meant being Western. So they weren't at all happy with the 80% of the population who were not like a Westerner. Which really, if you're thinking of 1923, no one in Turkey looked like this. Today, everyone in Turkey looks like everyone in this room. In 23, no one would have done. It would have been, as indeed it is largely today, quite a religious population. It would be a largely peasant, overwhelmingly peasant population. which the ruling cadres really didn't like. This is a classical story of westernization and modernization, which several other countries in the Middle East went through. But Turkey went through this earliest and most farthest along the road to modernization. So you have a state which is, the rulers of which are unhappy with effectively the whole of the population. Therefore, you have an extremely repressive state. You have a state where the military are never far behind the scenes, and they have to be. If you are telling 20% of the population, no, you're not Kurdish, you're Turkish. If you're telling another 20%, you may be Alevi, but I don't want to hear about it. If you're telling smaller percentages, if you may be Jewish, but you are going to speak Turkish, not your own language. If you're telling, again, a smaller percentage of Armenians that they cannot speak Armenian and have to behave like Turks, and the dominant ideology, the official ideology of the state, is that everyone who lives here is a Turk. The first constitution, 1924, actually says so. Everyone who is a Turkish citizen is a Turk. You can only keep that going if you use force. There is no other way of doing it. Particularly if the large majority of people are not behind you, because you are thinking, you the state, is thinking, these people are too religious, too backward, too peasants, and we're going to change them. So that secularism became effectively a banner for hounding people and stopping people from living their religiosity in the way that they wanted to, stopping women wearing the headscarf from being public servants, and more recently, even from going to university. You have this sort of state. You can only keep that going if you use force and violence and oppression. And of course, post-war Turkish history has got 3 military coups, 1960, 1971, 1980. I can see Pete smiling because he's watched all of them, and I was here most of that time. Not as early as 1960, but... and then after 1980, you have a number of attempted coups and 1 or 2 coups, military coups, which didn't involve tanks in the streets, but involved the military issuing a memorandum to the government and overthrowing it in that way. Now, this brings us up, effectively, to the year 2000. And now we can look through the 2 keyholes. If we look through the Kurdish keyhole, what we see is a series of Kurdish uprisings, the first of which was in 1920, first in the Republican period, was in 1925. And there's several others, all of them put down extremely violently, always branded in the early period, not as Kurdish uprisings by the state, but as reactionary, religious, Islamic uprisings. And there was probably an Islamic element in it, but effectively there were national Kurdish uprisings. All the way, and a constant effort to assimilate the Kurds and Turkify them, complete refusal to recognize officially that there is such a thing as a Kurd, so that Kurds were branded at different times through Republican history as Mountain Turks, as a sort of side branch of the Turkish ethnicity and all that, until in the mid-1980s, the current, what the Kurds themselves consider to be the latest and current Kurdish uprising, the one led by the PKK, started in the mid-1980s. Within about 15 years, the uprising led by the PKK, which didn't start as an uprising, it started as a very small guerrilla movement, but within 15 years, it had turned into a popular mass national movement with roots far beyond the armed struggle and the guerrilla struggle, with extensive roots in the Kurdish towns and cities, mass popular support, and effectively had convinced the Turkish state that there could be no military solution to the Kurdish problem. The Turkish state, including the armed forces, have really known for the past 15 years, or perhaps even more, that they were not going to be able to make the Kurdish question go away through military means. But this, the Kurdish struggle, which effectively is now coming to an end with victory for the Kurds, in the sense of being recognized by the Turkish state and a series of other reforms which are all now being discussed in detail in the Turkish parliament and throughout Turkish society and the media and everywhere. Steps like stronger local government, reintegrating the PKK guerrillas into Turkish political life, releasing Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, from prison. You know, effectively the Turkish state, who said there are no Kurds for 60 years, 70 years, is now negotiating a roadmap for solution of the Kurdish issue with the leader of the guerrilla group which has brought the Turkish state to its knees. There is no other way of seeing it. But a side effect of the Kurdish successful struggle has been that once the Turkish state has to say, yes, there are Kurds, and I'm negotiating with them to recognize their existence officially and in the constitution and by law, once they say this, then the argument that Turkey belongs to Turks, anyone who's in Turkey is a Turk, all these rabid nationalist arguments are just undercut. They become meaningless. And through the door which the Kurdish armed struggle, which then grew into a political struggle, opened, all sorts of other forces, some of them very weak. For example, the Armenians in Turkey. There are only 50,000 Armenians in Turkey, in a total population of 75 million. And the Turkish state has always refused to recognize the 1915 genocide of Armenians. Now it's on the agenda. Now it's openly discussed. Next year is the centenary of the genocide. There's going to be all sorts of events commemorating it. And my personal view is that the Turkish state is on the verge of recognizing and possibly even apologizing for 1915. So the Armenians, only 50,000 of them, so not, you know, a whole people with an armed guerrilla organization, a weak force, nevertheless have managed to go through that door which the Kurdish movement opened. The Alevi question. The Alevi, as I said, 20% of the population, so a minority, strongly discriminated against in officialdom. Now it's an issue which is discussed in a livelier way than it has ever been. So, that's one keyhole, the Kurdish struggle, which over the past 15 to 20 years has effectively forced a huge crack in the edifice of the Kemalist, nationalist Turkish state. The other keyhole is more complicated, because often in Turkey the view is that, try and picture the map of Turkey, this rectangle, the central parts of which, it's a little bit like the US, I've just thought of that, don't carry that parallel too far. But, you know, in some elections in the US, you get red dots for the states which the Democrats have won, and a blue sea in the middle where the Republicans have won. Turkey's usually a bit like that. The central part is rural, much more rural than the coastal areas and the big cities. It's rural, quite conservative, quite religious, and it is always the case that religious and fascist parties tend to get most of their votes from that area. And it's more or less solidly Sunni Muslim Turkish. Now, unless we try to understand the problems that that group, that majority, suffered throughout Republican history, it's very difficult, it would be very difficult to understand where the hell the AKP, the current government, came from. How a government emerged in a rabidly secular, state-enforced secular country, which comes, a party which comes from an Islamic tradition, and a party which basically represents that majority, which has been kept out of politics for about 80 years by the westernizing, modernizing state. Unless we understand how pissed off that huge crowd was, I stress this because if I say this in Turkey at a left-wing meeting, there would be people sneering at me from every corner of the room. Because the idea of the Turkish left is that Sunni Muslims are the majority and they're reactionary bastards because they're Muslims. So, you know, what do they suffer? Well, what they suffered was, as I mentioned earlier, that they were forced into living a life where they would have to downplay how religious they were, and they were kept out of the stage of national politics, off the stage of national politics. Now, in the late 1990s, two things happened. First of all, a party emerged which these people could vote for. And secondly, as I already have said, the Turkish state realized it wasn't going to be able to beat the Kurdish movement. So, from two sides, the silent majority, if I may use that term, of Sunni Muslims who wanted change, who didn't want to continue to be this silent, apolitical majority, on the one hand, and the Kurdish movement on the other hand, got the Turkish state in a corner. This is what allowed the current government to come to power. When he came to power, immediately, we now know in great detail, the chiefs of the armed forces went into session, and basically for about 3 years, all they did at work at the general headquarters of the military was to plan a military coup which would overthrow this Islamic, reactionary, dark, Middle Ages, you know the literature about Islam. How are we going to overthrow these people? This forced the government into taking on the military. They probably wouldn't have done, because they're not socialists, they're not revolutionaries, they're not even anti-nationalists. Of course they're not, because they do represent this majority of quite conservative, quite religious masses who consider the Turkish state to be their state. So the AKP government is not, by instinct or by politics, a reforming government. But it was forced into it because the military were going to overthrow it if the government didn't deal with the military. So we've been through a period of 10 to 15 years. 2002 this government came to power. They've been through 3 elections, 3 national elections, and a whole number of local elections, all of which they've won. They have not lost a single election in 12 years. Most recently, last March. And again, it's difficult to understand how this could be unless you understand that the nearly 50% of the Turkish population who vote for them have this history of having problems with the modernizing state. Now, let me scoot right up to the present and just look at the past year, because things have started changing in the past year. The past year has been a year of one horror after another for the government. It started at the end of last May with the Gezi Park events, which I will say very little about because you all know about it. Then in December, there was an almighty corruption scandal about the government, which again I will say very little about because there's a very complex background to it, and I would have to go through various Islamic brotherhoods in Turkey because it's members of one of these brotherhoods who revealed the corruption cases. Forget about that, it doesn't matter. What matters is that there was corruption, but the government was again shaken, and then finally there was a mining disaster, which again, I'm assuming most of you will have read about in the Western press. So the government went from one crisis, one problem to the other, and attempted to deal with it like any conservative governments anywhere in the world would, with police force. So that, you know, in the Gezi period, 7 people were killed by plastic bullets used by the police. Not even plastic bullets, gas canisters fired into the crowd. So the government has been shaky for the past year. After 11 years of looking unshakable, it has become shaky. Clearly the Gezi events indicated the emergence of a new kind of quite young movement made up of quite young people who wanted change, who were not happy with the increasing authoritarianism of the government. Clearly the response to the mining disaster, for the first time in ages in Turkey, was a relatively serious working class response. Very short-lived, but relatively more serious than anything that's happened in the recent past. Nevertheless, at the end of all that, 30th of March this spring, there were nationwide local elections and the government got 44% of the vote. So a year of being shaken really didn't touch their vote. And the reason, the problem, if any of you were at Alex Kalinikos's meeting yesterday about is the far left in crisis, that's where the link comes in. Because throughout this past year, when the government was shaky, there has been no working class response. This was also a problem with the Gezi movement. There was no working class, organised working class elements within it. Of course there were workers. In fact, statistics were that 57 people at the park were in work, so they're working people. But they were there as individuals, not with any union banners, not in any way representing their trade unions. And this has been the problem in Turkey for revolutionaries, yes, but also for the country as a whole, over the past 15 years. First of all, the emphasis initially in the first period of this government was on the struggle against the military, then the struggle against the law which bans the headscarf in universities and public offices. Very important struggles in which we were extremely active. Nevertheless, no one took part in those struggles as an organised worker, as an organised workforce. These were political struggles without an industrial component to them. This was clearest in Gezi, but throughout the past year it has become even clearer that there is a mood for change in Turkey. There is a growing challenge to the government, even amongst its own base. This hasn't been reflected in the electoral, in the votes yet, but I can't imagine that there aren't quite a large number of believing Muslims who are unhappy that 7 youngsters were killed in a movement where they were not armed, they were not violent. Why were 7 killed? Why were 301 miners killed when everyone knew that the mine was unsafe? So I can't imagine that there are not religious people voting for the AKP for the past 3 national elections who are not thinking, this isn't good, this isn't properly Muslim. They might be thinking of it in religious terms or other terms, but they'll be unhappy. So there is a mood and there is a sense in the country of a serious fight back being possible, but there is no working class elements in that, and the working class in Turkey is less well unionized than it was 20 years ago. Union membership has gone down by about 50%. There are 7 trade union confederations. I always used to think the poor French working class, they have 3 trade union confederations. There are 7 in Turkey, possibly more. You know, last time I counted it was 7. So it's very divided in terms of organisation. It hasn't scored any major victories for a long time in the workplace. It has on the political level. And this is the problem, which, unless it's cracked, and it could be cracked at any moment. It wouldn't have surprised me if the fight back after the mining disaster had generalised. It would have surprised everyone, but it was on the cards. It's difficult, but that, I think, is a problem in Turkey at the moment.
Okay, comrades, we've got now time for questions and contributions.
Chris Stevenson, March 21, Turkey. I just want to, in 3 minutes I can only deal with just one thing, so I'm going to talk about my own experiences in my workplace and how that relates to the questions of Kemalism and nationalism. Because of course the question is what to do. What to do in this situation? What should revolutionaries do? What's the key question? One of the key questions is the influence of Kemalism or nationalism in the working class movement, because it holds us back. I unionised my workplace, which is a private university with 1,300 employees. The blue-collar workers, white-collar workers and the academics are all in the same union. And I can paint you a little picture of what it's like with the blue-collar workers. There are 3 leading militants, all called Mehmet. One is an Alevi, and a Social Democrat who probably voted for the Republican People's Party in the election. One is a Kurd, who votes for the Kurdish party. The other is also a Kurd, but a deeply religious man who prays 5 times a day and votes for the ruling party, the AK Party. And of those three, the most consistent, successful union militant is the pious Muslim, and the one who's most determined as a union militant. And we have real problems in our relationship with the union bureaucracy in particular because they can't accept that a pious Muslim can be a union militant. And we've had terrible problems. You know, they've insisted on having meetings in places where alcohol is served and so on. I mean, they're really behaving disrespectfully to someone who's actually made considerable sacrifice. He, for 3 months, stood outside and got his job back. Right, fought a resistance of 3 months along with the others and got his job back, and was prepared to accept being downgraded when he was reinstated in order that he could continue organising inside the workplace. That's the kind of battles we have inside the working class movement, where actually Kemalism and nationalism, the influence of nationalism on the left is holding us back. So what to do? I mean, there is always a fight. Gezi was a fight. Gezi Park was not united. There was a fight in Gezi Park between nationalism, the Turkish Youth Union, and the Kurds. There was a fight about whether the Kurds were going to be allowed to stay there or whether the Turkish Union were going to stone them, and it was an intervention of the left that prevented that from happening. So the question is what to do. The question is to fight nationalism in order to build up the working class movement. That's one of the big obstacles. And so we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity that the Kurdish movement, which Ronnie mentioned, is actually operating, is opening itself to an alliance with the left. And that's been a series of electoral alliances, starting in a small way in 2002, much more successfully in 2007 and 2011. And now we had in the local elections and in the presidential election coming up in August, we have the People's Democratic Party, which is an alliance between the Turkish left, or some of the Turkish left, those are the Turkish left who are smart enough to and the Kurdish movement, in order to try and create an opposition in Turkey which doesn't exclude the Muslims, which is not secularist, which doesn't exclude the Kurds, which doesn't exclude the Alevis. And in the local elections, the People's Democratic Party candidates included women who were wearing a headscarf, Christians, Armenians, Suryani. I mean, in other words, it was an inclusive election campaign, which is setting an entirely new pattern in Turkish politics. So you have to watch that space, and that's an important point of intervention for revolutionary socialists, is trying to build that. In other words, to try and break down this 90 years of reaction, of nationalist reaction, come with us 91 years now, from 1920, 23. In other words, to break down that tradition, to create an inclusive movement which is both across religious boundaries and national boundaries, and that is one of our key struggles, because only when we can do that can we actually really begin to rebuild the working class movement.
I'm also formerly working at a Turkish university, but a state university that is often the castle of nationalism, Marmara University. We have regular marches by the Fascist Party where they raise their fingers and chant and such things. Grey wolves, yeah.
It's great. That's the symbol of the fascists. It's a grey wolf.
But I think, just in response to your point, I'm not so hopeful for the HDP's electoral prospects going further, because as Ronnie said, the Kurdish movement is split, and people are feeling that, yes, these other issues are quite important, but we need to keep back on the Kurdish issue. There's some criticism within the Kurdish movement. But I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned is the AKP's goals going forward. And they have, with their school changes, begun to produce a pious generation, and they are actively forming the Imam Hatip high schools, which are the religious schools, are taking over lots of kids who can't go into other schools. Extra classes are being allowed, Kurdish being one of them, but there are no Kurdish teachers to do so, and those are only in non-state schools, sorry. And so Sunni education is being pushed on other people and their vision of Sunni education. So you have classes on the life of the Prophet, on studying the Quran, which is obviously alienating the Alevis, the Christians and other groups who don't want such things. I think also another important thing is the issue of social solidarity, which if you read the chapter in Turkey Reframed, Gebze, which is the main industrial area near Istanbul, in the 1970s was quite left-wing, presumably Kemalist left-wing, I would imagine at the time, but now social solidarity is purely through the Islamic lodges. So they're taking over welfareism, which is one of the things that the AKP do pre-election, is they flood things with hospitals and allowing social policy and things like that. But the last thing is, I've got just two things that I'd recommend people to watch. One is a documentary called Nefret, which is about hate crimes in Turkey. And it's only under the AKP that such issues can be raised, which I think is an important thing. The other one is called Ikna Odessa, which is stories from women who were not allowed to go into university. But all of these things are being done by generally women, who are also critical of the AKP, but they will vote AKP, religious covered women. And then the last thing, I slightly disagree with you on how much the military and the previous trials have been nothing more than show trials. I don't think they were planning so much. I don't think Danny Roderick's work kind of undermines that a little bit. I don't think so much. So I think it's but that's up to, not that I don't think they would do it. But that's it. Thanks.
Perhaps something on the AKP thing. I still remember because I was quite astonished when the AKP first stood. I think, especially in Istanbul, for elections. They got an astonishing big vote for first building a sort of social network, social institutions, helping especially the poor people in the gecekondos, in the poor areas at the outskirts of Istanbul, and they were very modern. They had even an ex-prostitute standing as a candidate. So they really, in these areas, I don't know how it was in Eastern Turkey, they appeared very modern, and there is a way they still are very modern because they are the driving force of destroying the state capitalist institutions, factories and so on in Turkey. And there was a big state area with like glasses made in state factories and so on. So in a way they are absolutely modern neoliberal party, and it could be the CSU, the most conservative Catholic party in Germany, who had done this. So there's only this contradiction, as you said, that Muslims, even being a minority, were in a way repressed, that they couldn't just live their religion like they may do in Germany.
I just want to ask a question about the economic situation in Turkey, because I want to find out the impact of neoliberalism in Turkish working class and also day-to-day life of ordinary people, because we know there is a privatization of Turkish industry, state-owned factories and industries started in 1984 after the military coup introduced by Turgut Özal. But between 1984 and 2002, the privatization was, I think, $9 billion worth of state-owned factories were privatized. But between 2002 and 2012, the privatization was huge. But in 2005, the first 7 months of 2005, 18 billion worth of the dollars worth of public-owned companies were privatized. And suddenly there was a huge leap. And so I want to find out what was the impact of this privatization. Because I teach in an FE college in Bradford, and the majority of my students are Muslim background, and they really idealize. You can't imagine how they idealize Turkey as a modern Muslim country and also with strong Islamist tradition. He said the Turkish economy is absolutely brilliant. Why don't you? Every time they ask me a question, I challenge them. No, actually, Turkey is not really good. It's the impact of neoliberalism is not good. They say, how dare you can tell us Turkey is not good? Turkey is one of the best countries in the world. They want to live in Turkey. I'm not kidding you. I'm not kidding. They want to go and live in Turkey because they look at Erdogan as a leader in the Middle East as well. Just because of he once challenged an Israeli prime minister. There's a big joke in Turkey, 1 minute. I don't want to go on that.
1 minute?
1 minute, sir. It's my Bradfordian accent, you know, sorry. And second question I want to ask, again, we got, I did get this question, I'm struggling to answer this question. You may have, or some of our comrades have answer, as why Turkish economy is high. I mean, between 2002 and 2012, even during the economic crisis in Europe, as the Turkish growth was 8-9%. Now, the first 4 months of the year, I think it was growth was 4%. Still very higher than what we have in here. What made this?
You don't have any growth here.
Yeah, we don't have it as 0 minus 1. So what made this grow? How did it happen? And I wanna, if you have an answer for it, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karen from IS Austria, and my English is not very good, but I tried. We in Austria, we have with our group United Fronts with Turkish left groups, and sometimes it's really hard to work together because of course there is a big debate inside how backwards Muslim persons are, and is the AKP and fascist party and stuff like that. And sometimes it's not really easy to work together, but we work together in union things, trade union things, we work together in anti-fascist protests, etc., etc. And we also built up together protests when 2 weeks ago Erdogan comes to Vienna. And we built up this protest together to make clear Erdogan is not welcome here. And there was over 10,000 people on the streets of Vienna. And it was very important for us to arguing we are protest against Erdogan because his neoliberal politics, because his politics in the question of protest movements like Gezi, etc. But we also make clear that our own states are not much better. Yeah, this chauvinism who is always there, oh, the Turkish state is horrible, but ours are very good, have to confront from us. Because if you look to Genua, if you look the protests there, if you look to our anti-fascist protests, the Occupy movement in the United States, always there was a massive police repression who hit these movements down and so it's always easy for our ruling class to say, oh, Erdogan, he's horrible, but we are so democratic and we are so good, and it's important to make clear, no, this is not right. Every capitalist state, if it's Austria or Turkey, have a really repressive police system, and so I think it's very important for us to have clear in the call for the demonstration, the paper call for action. We are against Islamophobia and we are against fascism and racism because in Austria there's a very big problem with Islamophobia, and there's also a big problem with racism against Turkish people. It's very in the center of the Austrian Fascist Party from the FPÖ, and so I think it's very important for us to fight against it because Gezi and so on, they use also, but they are fascist and the use is just.
Hello, Graham from south of here, Kent. It's simply a question. What sort of a challenge or an increased challenge is the Turkish government facing because of events in Iraq and Syria in relation to the Kurdish community? Thank you.
I'm also from Turkey. My name is Sheila. Just I want to call you that there is a presidential election on 9th of August, and all around Europe, you know that there's lots of immigrants from Turkey came from 12th of September military coup. They stayed around, and there are lots of Kurdish people who came during the war. They left their villages and they moved into ghettos all around the European cities. There are comrades around here. They should know that this presidential election is important for Turkish left, revolutionary left, and for all the oppressed people, because we managed to bring an important alignment, a coalition organization where where Ronnie belongs, our organization, and other type of traditions and Kurdish movement. We are together in this election, and I think the title is conservatism and authoritarianism, yeah, and this is a fight between really authoritarianism and freedom in Turkey, because two presidential candidates representing the same line, and we are representing the only solution for all the oppressed and exploited people. So I want you to make sure that wherever you work with the Turkish people, Kurdish people, who has any link with Turkey, they should vote for HDP. That's the only solution for the Turkish working class people and the oppressed.
It's more of a question. My two sisters are half Turkish, and one of the things they constantly complain about and are very excited about when it comes to stay here is international censorship, particularly on the internet, and how they can't find much information on outside of purposes, or when they want to share information, they often complain that they can't always bypass certain censorships. And if you could maybe tell us more about that.
Hi, my name is Ferofrat. I'm from Hackney disability and Kurds from Turkey. As far as I concern, civilization in Turkey as a project is not completed because Ronnie still has a mustache. I have a question actually, is because as a revolution socialist, and when I look at Turkey day in and day out, particular law since 2011 regarding of Syria and asylum seekers and people who refuge in Turkey, and even Kurdish organization, we have to be honest, we are socialists. Even they, of course, they have their own problems because of Rojava and the Kurds and etc. But they are even not welcoming immigrants from Syria. And I'm wondering, and our organization in Turkey, what we are doing in terms of this refugee. Just a few days ago in Gaziantep, and over 100 people gathered in the city center. They are demanding and deporting all refugees who came from Syria. Could you please tell something about this issue? Thank you.
I think we shouldn't forget how the Turkish government banned YouTube in the country for a while, and this was not recognised because of how things happen in Ukraine and Russia. And also the solicitors and barristers have been getting control under the government, and this is also a big issue in the parliament. So even though Turkey has developed as an Islamic state, they have very fascist things, and they did very harsh things for the people and for the working class.
I should have said this to you afterwards, but it'll lead me on to something else. You see, throughout the period I described, when the government was fighting against military intervention and the military presence in Turkish politics, of course the state fought back ideologically as well as in every other way. Now, there is no doubt that they were planning coups. We know this because so much documentation was leaked. The head of the naval forces kept a diary. This was leaked. The whole diary was leaked. It's wonderful. It's on the internet. It's truly an education to read that. I mean, I once wrote in our paper, if some sort of external enemy had invaded Turkey from the west, by the time the chiefs of staff noticed it, the enemy would probably have walked out the other side, because they were too busy discussing everything but military matters. Now, so there is no doubt that this was the case. The governments, starting in 2007, basically gave the green light to the judiciary to take the military, to take the plotters to court. The court cases were badly handled. Certainly there were problems, but the problems weren't that people were framed. But throughout this period, both Kemalist propaganda and, unfortunately, Turkish left propaganda, and I will explain this in a moment, always said this is just a trick by Islamists to disband our wonderful Turkish state, etc., etc., etc. So, for example, you mentioned what the government is doing in education. That, again, is constantly something which the Kemalists and the left harp on about. It's true to a degree, but it's not something I would go on about. The reason it's not something I would go on about is that that is not the way to fight the government. If you fight the government on issues which most of the population actually values, most of the population values the fact that there are schools, religious schools. By the way, the curriculum is not religious, but, you know, it's sort of conservative, semi-religious schools to which they can send their kids. If you get up as a socialist and say these schools are such and such, you will immediately be branded in the minds of the majority of the population as someone who represents what the state has done to them for the past 90 years. I think it's wrong anyway to do that, but tactically it's suicidal, not just wrong. To move to the Turkish left from that, the comrade from Austria mentioned it. Now, I didn't go into this in my talk because it's almost a subject of a talk all by itself. The Turkish left comes from two traditions which have merged. One is Stalinism, the other is Kemalism. The reason these two traditions could turn into this unholy soup so easily is that there's a lot of common ground between Kemalism and Stalinism. Both are politics which say we know better what is good for the people. Kemalism says this, Stalinism obviously says this. It is the essence of Kemalism that we, the people who run the state, know what it means to be a good citizen, and whether you like it or not, I will make you a good citizen. Now, Stalinism doesn't quite do that, but it's not very far removed from it. The Turkish left has learnt its politics, most of the Turkish left, from these two sources. Therefore, they have taken also from both these sources the understanding, which has no place in Marxism at all, that religion means reaction. Now, there is anyone who actually reads Marx, rather than the publications of the Moscow, what was it called? Moskova Bilimler Akademisi neydi ya? Whatever. Science Academy, the Moscow Science Academy. Anyone who's learnt Marxism from Marx rather than Stalin would have no such view about religion. Almost all of the Turkish left has this view about religion. They all know that Marx said religion is the opium of the people. Very, very few of them know that Marx said in the same sentence, religion is a sign of the oppressed, it's the heart of a heartless world. So, and of course Kemalism does the same thing. Kemalism in 1923, the main aim was to establish a secular state, make religious people invisible, and push them out of public life, out of politics. So, coming from these two sources, the Turkish left, in 2002, when this party was elected, immediately said, right, terrible danger, catastrophe, we are heading for an Islamic state. They said this for several years, until it was bloody obvious to the blindest person, politically, that we weren't heading anywhere like an Islamic state, because this party had been in power for several years and didn't do anything which could, even by the farthest stretch of the imagination, be considered to be Islamic. This is still the case. They've been in power for 12 years with a comfortable parliamentary majority, with 50% of popular support. They have done nothing which can be interpreted in political life, in public life, in the law as Islamic. So after a few years, the Turkish left thought, what do we say? So then it was reactionary. But then these people, this government, started putting four-star generals into jail, into prison, for plotting to take over the politics of the country. They even gave the green light for the prosecution of the generals who had carried out the military coup in 1980, which led to tens of thousands of people in prison, tortured, all trade unions closed down. There's no debate about it. It was horrific. They actually started prosecuting the two generals who are still alive. All of the Turkish left said, no, this is a show trial, they will never be sentenced. 2 months ago they were sentenced to life in prison. So all the ground is disappearing under the feet. Of course, all the left said, this government cannot solve the Kurdish problem because this government doesn't care, it's fascist. Comrade, no, it isn't fascist. Fascist is something else. It is authoritarian. A fascist party doesn't recognize the Kurdish people. If it does, then there's something odd with fascism, or we could even say there's something quite nice about fascism, which I don't think we want to do. So now, this month, Öcalan has been saying for the past year and a half, when negotiations had been going very well, that what is now required is for the negotiations to be put on a legal footing. The government has just done that. The next thing Öcalan was saying was we need to move beyond negotiations and actually start talking about a roadmap of what we're going to do. 2 weeks ago, the Deputy Prime Minister said, we're now discussing a roadmap. So the Turkish left really has got nothing left to say. Here we are, a reactionary, Islamic, backward, Middle Ages government has done everything, which under normal circumstances, I think the Austrian comrade was saying something like that, you would expect a left social democratic government to do. I'm not talking of Tony Blair's Labour Party. You know, something far to the left of that. So, this is, of course, a serious problem for much of the Turkish left, because they have effectively disappeared. The 3 or 4, 5 major-ish groups on the Turkish left all take part in national elections. At the last national election, general election, 2 years ago, 2011 was it? 2011. All of them together got less than 1% of the vote. And there is nothing in the least surprising about this, because if you can only criticise a government which gets 50% of the vote for being Islamic, then no one's going to vote for you. It's a country where most people are religious. It's a country where 70% of women cover their hair, their head. Who's going to vote for you if all you're doing is criticising this government for being Islamic? So we really mustn't make any concessions at all to that. I'm not saying you are, but some of the things you said were reminiscent of it. Now, interesting issue of which Ümit brought up. There is a contradiction, isn't there? When I used to do these talks at Marxism or elsewhere in Europe, a few years ago, I'd say, isn't Turkey a weird fucking country? You have a government from an Islamic tradition, conservative government, neoliberal government, doing things which, well, I just said it a minute ago, you would only expect in the West a left social democratic government to do. You then have a party in Turkey which claims to be social democratic and is fighting tooth and nail against recognition of the Armenian genocide, against peace with the Kurds, you know, against anything which anyone in their right minds would think this is a good thing. It's democratic, if nothing else. So it's contradictory in that sense, and that's just a contradiction caused by Kemalism, because the Turkish so-called Social Democratic Party is Kemalist before it is Social Democratic, which means it's not Social Democratic at all. But also, how come this government is so popular, in spite of all the privatisation you were talking about? I think the main reason is political. The main reason is the one I talked about in my initial talk. The fact that the mass of this country, for the first time, feels they've come onto the political stage and it's their government in power. But also, Turkey's been very lucky economically. And it is luck. It isn't anything the government has done. The reason that for many of the past 10 years, the Turkish economy grew at a rate which was second only to China, year after year, over the past 10 years. That obviously helps a government. And the reason is that Turkey's main trading partner in Europe, well, the main trading partner, is the one country in Europe which hasn't collapsed, Germany. Turkey's main trading partner is Germany. If something happens to the German economy, God forbid, the same thing will happen to the Turkish economy. So that was the major reason. A second reason was that, as you know, the crisis of 2007 and 8 started in the financial sector. Now, Turkey had its financial crisis in 2004, and they took precautions, restructured the banking sector, brought in serious regulation of the banks, so that when the 2007-2008 crisis hit, the Turkish banks were very solid. They'd already had that crisis and taken measures against it. So this government has just been very lucky, and they've also used it very well. So privatization, for example, they're busy privatizing the health service. Not something like the NHS, but they're busy privatizing every hospital, and the building of private hospitals must be one of the boom sectors at the moment. But they're doing it in a very intelligent way. What happens in Turkey, you speak to anyone, and public hospitals are nightmares. Everyone will tell you this. You go there and queue for 2 days. What they've done now, you can go to a public hospital, and if they don't have the equipment you need, or the space, or the beds, or whatever, they'll refer you to a private hospital. That only speeds up the process of privatization. But if you're at the receiving end of it, you're really happy about it, because you end up being sent to a private hospital where you're not going to queue, and the state will pay for you to be treated. So, also housing. Now, I know for a fact that not a single council flat has been built in Britain since Terry was a kid. How many years? I don't know. 20 years? In Turkey, this government has built hundreds of thousands of low-cost flats. Now, again, it works both ways. What it means is that the construction sector has been the locomotive of the economy. As you know, construction employs people, it helps the mining sector, the furniture sector. It really can be a locomotive. If it's private flats that's being built, that's a bubble which will burst. But if you're building low-cost housing, which you then sell to not poor people, but sort of poorish people, then you're doing two things. You're providing a locomotive for the economy, and you're creating lots of happy voters. So they've done it in a contradictory way. The end result is privatization, but they're not losing votes. That's the explanation. Do I have time for one or two more? Yeah. Syrian refugees, Ferrell's points. Of course, I've already said, because the Turkish left is, as I've described it, there's something like, what is it now? More than 1 million Syrian refugees in Turkey? 1.5 million. The Turkish left turns a complete blind eye to it. Why? Because they support Assad. Because they consider Assad to be an anti-imperialist fighter. So, they are, not only is this bad politics, but it's fucking inhuman. Because much of the Turkish left says the Syrian refugees are really all Al-Qaeda militants. Well, if Al-Qaeda had 1.5 million militants, I think we would now be living in an Islamic world. But, joking apart, what kind of absolute inhuman heartlessness is it for a socialist? It's what fascists in the West say about all migrants, but particularly migrants from the Arab countries. The Turkish left says the same thing about Syrian refugees. And therefore, it is an important issue. It's an issue about which we have had one or two campaigns, but it comes and goes. It comes onto the agenda, the campaign can be quite successful, and then it sort of ebbs. But it is a crucial issue, not only in humanitarian terms, but also political terms, because it really differentiates socialists from Stalinists. Iraq, Syria, the Kurds. Now, this is very complex, because for years and decades, Turkey's main foreign policy concern, as far as the Middle East goes, was to stop the possibility of any kind of Kurdish entity, any state, from being created, because it would give the wrong ideas to Kurds who live in Turkey. Now it's much more complex. First of all, the Kurds in Turkey are not asking for independence, are not asking for a separate state. So relations are good between the Kurdish movements and the Turkish state. So I think Turkish government policy at the moment is not as strongly against a Kurdish state in the Middle East as it used to be, because they obviously thinking, that must be the thinking behind it, that if there is a Kurdish state, they can control it, they can be its main trading partner, they can, through the Kurds of Turkey, they can have influence within it. But of course, I think, I wrote in Socialist Worker a couple of weeks ago, the Kurds have made incredible gains over the past few years. There's the Kurdish autonomous region in northern Iraq, which, whatever we call it, it's a de facto state. It's a Kurdish state. Now there's a similar area in Syria. It's called Rojava, as Farah mentioned. Not quite as advanced as the northern Iraqi one, but effectively, again, under the control of Kurdish forces. And the Kurds in Turkey are very near total agreement with the Turkish state. These are massive gains after hundreds of, well, many decades of struggle. But I think the emergence of ISIS, the collapse of Syria, the near collapse of Iraq because of the ISIS offensive, all of these things, Iran meddling more and more. Whenever things go haywire in the Middle East, the Kurds have so far in the past always lost out, because the rulers take the opportunity to lay into their own Kurds. So I'm very scared that such a thing might repeat itself, because both Kurdish entities are tenuous. So it's very complex, and we'll just have to wait and see. I did want to talk about what Chris and Sheila talked about. Maybe I should. Have I got 2 minutes? Yeah.
A few minutes.
Okay. Now, the party they were mentioning, the HDP, the People's Democratic Party, is a party which basically was set up by the Kurdish movement, but different from the already existing parliamentary Kurdish political party, in the sense that the idea was this would be a party for Turks as well. This would be a party for the whole of Turkey, and it would be the Turkish left party. We're involved in it, the comrades are involved in it, but the comrades are more involved in it than we are. And the reason is this. There is no chance of this party becoming the left party of Turkey. And I'll explain this in the simplest possible term. Can you imagine the IRA creating the new British left? It wouldn't work, would it? This is the analogy. I think our job, we need to be in that party, of course, because It's whatever the Kurdish movement does, we should be involved in it, we should support it, we should show solidarity, and that's why we are involved in it. But we should be under no illusions that this is anything to do with the new Turkish left. 99% of the party is made up of Kurds and the Kurdish movement. And to call a spade, this party was created on the recommendation, and I use that word so that I don't have to say the orders, of Öcalan in prison, which is fine, no problem for me. But everyone knows this. And there are two problems with that. One, when everyone knows this, there is no way that this party can get votes outside of the Kurdish areas and Istanbul, because there is a huge Kurdish presence in Istanbul. You will not get votes anywhere else, and you cannot have a localized socialist party. And the other problem is, just as Öcalan recommended that such a party be created, when conditions change, he may recommend that we don't need that party anymore, because basically, quite rightly, he's only concerned with what the Kurdish movement is doing. He's suggested the HDP, not for the interests of Turkey, the interests of the Kurdish movement, which of course are his primary concern, as it should be. But the fact remains, such a party we should help, we should show solidarity, but we should be under no illusions that the Kurdish movement can create the new Turkish left. It doesn't work that way. Thank you.